the maturity model for Microsoft 365. What is it all about? Well, it's about helping your organization improve how it does things with Microsoft 365, helping it benefit from the investment in that technology, helping you come up with reasons with your powers that be of why you should be doing cool things with Copilot and search and governance and generative AI and all those things. That is its purpose. It's about having a business focused language where we can explain the benefits, the impacts on the business by increasing the maturity of your organization in these competencies. And that's really what it's about. Okay. So we had Michael Blumenthal join us a couple of months ago. Oh yeah, it was last month, wasn't it? Sorry, last month. And
time flies.
And he introduced the service change management, practical scenarios, and servicing Microsoft 365 apps in there as well. And I know that he's sort of keen to get involved more and on that practical scenario side as well. So that's fantastic. Of course, if any of you would like to join and present what you've been doing or have ideas, then please reach out to us. The maturity model has 5 levels, level 100 being the initial level, level 200 being that kind of intermediate to getting to being somewhat good, level 300 is kind of we think that an organization should be at this level. Level 400, we're learning to be better. We're measuring, we're learning what works to make us more predictable so that we can then reach that nirvana panacea state of level 500. So that's kind of how we describe the levels, or maybe that's how I describe levels. So we'll have a go at putting together mode, and if you would like to be part of the animation, please switch your videos on, and I will have a go at switching us to together mode and start recording. What should we do? Let's do the amphitheater. Let's have a go at that.
Surprisingly, this is always the hardest part of the entire call.
Oh, look at that. There we go. Right. I've actually been organized, and I've
excellent.
I've actually got some Camtasias all ready to go. So if everyone can wave, that'd be fantastic. Have I got my camera on? Right. And I'll record that. Sorry, let me just get that going.
Oh, we prematurely waved.
Okay, wave again. Go.
Oh, there are far more people than that, but everyone's being shy.
They are. It's okay. Right. Thank you very much. We've got that.
Thanks, Simon.
I'll switch over back to let's just share again. Right, okay, hopefully you can see my slides again. So, Camtasia decided to load over my PowerPoint. Right, let's go back to that. We'd love you to get involved. This is a community effort, and we'd love to kind of, even if it's just describing things you don't like, little tips, things you've learned. We'd love to hear about what's working for you, what's not working for you, and this is how you can get involved. You can present a case study, you can go onto GitHub and raise issues and spelling mistakes, give us feedback, or even just retweeting or re-Xing our content. So you can socialize what we're trying to do here. So yeah, that's how to get involved. And there's some links there to some of the recordings. And we're doing pretty well, actually. We've pretty much filled out our schedule for the rest of the year. So today we've got Emily revisiting the staff and training and people and communities. Next month we've got Michael Roth, who's going to be talking about the Power Platform and the Centre of Excellence. And we've got Simon and Sharon talking about employee experience on May. Anyway, you can see that, but we're trying to revisit things and trying to update and refresh things. In September, of course, we've got the obligatory co-pilot session, and in October, I'm really excited about this. Is thinking about, you know, how do organizations sort of look to the future, and sort of look at what might be impacting them. Maybe, you know, sort of co-pilot would be one of those things that they'd have thought about already. So yeah, and then Ignite is it might impact us on November, so we're just working that out. Right. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us last month, and it's great to see the same names coming and joining us, and so thank you for that. We've got, as I said, April the 16th is our next session with Michael Roth talking about Power Platform Centre of Excellence, and there's a link there to it. And if you need, if you want to kind of learn how to contribute, I know it's definitely scary the first time I started looking at contributing into GitHub and into the community docs, but there are links there to the Sharing is Caring initiative, which are running workshops on helping you get over those worries and giving you a good place to start and the skills you need to be able to get involved. Right. Okay. So we're coming to that time where there's a discussion. We're going to be revisiting these competencies on focusing on employee experience around staff and training and people and communities. And I'm not going to take all the. Emily's done some great slides, so I'll let her take you through those. But if you want to speak, then please raise your hand to say your piece, and please give us some feedback through reactions, what you're liking. Just remember to come off mute before you start speaking. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Emily. Hi, Emily. Welcome. Thank you very much for taking us on this journey through the competencies. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. As Simon mentioned, it's been quite a few years since the maturity model initiative has kind of resumed, since Sadie Van Buren's, Gil Ronan's original write-up of the SharePoint maturity model. And so as we're coming back and looking at these, I'm going to be putting on my external guest hat versus being one of the core team members, because I actually stepped away for a couple of years. So I haven't been in the same conversations in the past year since we started to explore different things like adding employee experience and how that maybe impacts some of our other competencies. So my goal today is to chat through my perspective of how I see the world a little bit differently and see what we can figure out together that makes sense for how to structure and make these next updates. And I have some proposals to show you all. I would very much love your opinions and feedback and experiences. So as Simon mentioned, please don't hesitate to raise your hand to speak or get involved in the chat. So one of the first things we're just going to start taking a peek at is what are some of the changes since we last spoke. For people, communities, and staff and training, it was about late 2022 when those articles first came out. And as you know, there's a lot that's been happening in the world of Microsoft 365 since then. So starting off with just focusing on our people and communities, some of the two biggest changes that we've had is that a retirement of Delve, so that person-centric space that you had, where you had your analytics, your profile, all your information, different people you were connected to, as well as boards where you can save that information. And then we've also had that evolution of Yammer into Viva Engage and really bringing that communities app forward in Microsoft Teams. Continuing on, we've also had the release of Viva Amplify, so our ability to track different campaigns and conversations across many communication platforms. So really elevating those conversations across our different communities. And we've been seeing a lot of expanded capabilities in Viva Connections. It's really just the first generation of Viva Connections that we had when the People and Communities article first came out. So we're seeing a lot more elevation in our community content coming into that feed, our ability to connect to some of these different person and community-centric activities in the dashboard as well. We're still going on all the things that have changed in people and communities since the last article. There is truly a lot as we've seen Viva explode. So we have the release of Viva Pulse and Viva Glint as well. For those who are a little bit less familiar, the main differences between them is that Viva Pulse is the self-serve survey tool for managers and leaders. And it's ad hoc feedback, and Viva Glint is more that company-wide tool for measuring employee satisfaction and well-being. So this is a really new introduction into Microsoft 365 out of the box, a way to get that feedback from our people and communities as well of how they're feeling about what's going on in the organization. And then how could I not mention the release of Copilot with something that's changed since our last discussion as well, all 10 trillion of them, it seems. Now, that's a lot that has changed, but what has stayed the same in our people and communities? We are still looking at hybrid communication needs across these different communities. There's still a strong interest in self-service so that we can create the communities that we need. A lot of businesses are still continuing that conversation on how we're going to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. And very often these are the different communities that support those conversations. And then last but not least, when we're having these conversations across these different communities, having them in context where they make sense. So knowing that all of those are still consistent, when we're looking at how we communicate across those communities, that also has still stayed the same. When we're trying to decide where to build some of these, we're thinking a lot about where our conversations are happening. Depending on our company culture, size, audience, persistence of message, our intent of the communication, and our integration needs, we might pick different places for these communities. For example, we might have a Microsoft org-wide team to talk to the whole organization. We might have a smaller subset of parents groups in Viva Engage. So now, moving off of people and communities, I promise we'll come back to talking about what's next for both of them, but just to talk about staff and training a little bit first as well. What are some of the things that have changed in this space? We have the release of Viva Goals. So we have the ability for people and teams to be tracking all of their different initiatives in a shared space that's fully integrated into Microsoft 365. We've also expanded some of our capabilities in Viva Learning. So last time we had the staff and training article published, we really focused on Microsoft 365 learning pathways. Now we have additional areas where we can build out our learning content depending on our integration needs and maturity level. Recently, I heard Caruana reference to the two different options of Microsoft 365 learning pathways is that early level, lower maturity. As in organizations, complex needs grow, then they start looking at expanding their content in Viva Learning. So we have a couple more options there. And then, of course, we have co-pilots that are going to impact our staff and training as well. What I'm really excited about when it comes to co-pilot and staff and training, in Miami, there's been a lot of conversations around the tech skills gap, and they're talking about this idea that artificial intelligence is going to be able to support our specific and unique learning needs in different ways. So I'm really excited to see how this is going to grow in the future. And we're not quite there yet to necessarily reflect all of that into these different competencies, but as we see Copilot growing, I see a lot more information that we can be adding. Now, what has stayed the same for staff and training since our last discussion? The tech skills gap is something that we're still very focused on. The nonprofit that I run, Left Uncharted, is focused on trying to reduce that tech skills gap in South Florida. And it's something I've seen very consistently across my consulting work with different organizations as well. Likely everyone on this call is not part of that tech skills gap. we're on the bleeding edge of this technology. There's still a wide berth of people who are uncomfortable with cloud, working from file shares, really trying to document information for that first time and put it into an environment and move off of that institutional knowledge that is just socialized. So looking at that tech skills gap, Microsoft has their bold claim that we need 149 million new tech workers by 2025. That's a ton of people. Hopefully, we'll be able to support them all through this community with free learning opportunities. But as you can imagine, as we're democratizing technology, there's also a bar that's being raised in what the expectations are around that training and what people need to do to be successful in the workplace. Oh, sorry, not quite ready to go off just yet. Thank you. So then when we're looking at digital first, a lot of organizations have really shifted and understood that whether it be internal or external customer support needs to be done in this digital place, supporting a lot of those different hybrid scenarios, especially we've seen this for some of those industries that have been lagging. So this may be organizations that were teams first and now have seen their maturity grow out of just having conversations there. They realize that they need to have documented information around business processes, expectations at work, and they're trying to build this into things like their intranets. Last piece we have is the reskilling revolution. While that is a new title, what is still the same is that upskilling opportunities are a huge incentive at jobs. So when people are looking for somewhere to work, having the opportunity to learn new skills and advance is incredibly important. So as we're talking about staff and training, this is really something critical when it comes to your employee engagement and retention as well. Now, moving forward, we've talked a bit about staff and training and people and communities. Let's add in employee experience and see what we can find on the edges of these different potential competencies. So looking at employee experience, here's 3 terms that people tend to throw around and not necessarily use consistently or in relation to each other. Kind of people treat them as if they're all in the same tier, but they're actually related to each other. So if we look at our next slide, I like to look at it as a bit of a nesting. So our user experience is our interactions with its company, service, and products. Now, this is the original definition, but the way that most people talk about user experience are really talking about people interacting with a product and the user interface. Because of that shift in our language, 2 different other areas have grown outside of user experience to include different interactions. The first one is employee experience. So this is going to be any interactions with your organization and context that underlies them. So we're talking about everything from the identification of you may want to apply to work at that company all the way through your departure potentially as you go through that full life cycle as an employee. It's going to include things like your workplace environment, your culture, the technology you use, and we'll go a little bit further into those elements. Outside of that, we have customer experience. So because customer experience is going to be people external as well as internal, we have that as the widest wrapper. So today what we're really talking about is that idea of that internal employee at a company anywhere in their journey from beginning to end in employment. So just to talk a little bit about why it's important before we go into building it into the competencies. We all know employees are people, not just workers, and work is a subset of our life, not separate from it. So many of us here are on this call donating our time because we're passionate about these initiatives, and bringing that passion into our work is going to make our content and objectives most successful. A lot of the value in organizations comes through our feelings, not just features that we have. So a lot of the employee success can come out of camaraderie that you have with your colleagues. And last but not least, the easiest sell is that turnover is really expensive. So it takes a long time to onboard someone. And once they're there, contributing value, it takes a really long time to replace them. So if we have someone in this great role, we want to make sure that we can keep them. And that definitely means creating that best possible employee experience that we can. So as we saw at the beginning of this call, this is our current approach to the maturity model for Microsoft 365. We have our purpose focused on improving the organization through technology, making sure we're selecting that correct approach, creating this framework where we really have a common language outside of just IT subject matter expertise, so we can talk about these outcome objectives across the organization and how Microsoft 365 can support any of those objectives. Now, looking at our published competencies, we have practical scenarios where we're really going further into these different topics in place. And then we have our Elevate articles for how you go across the different competencies. As I was diving into employee experience and looking at the edges of that with people and communities and staff and training, I started to break out and look at the structure a little bit differently. So let's dive into employee experience and the exercise I did trying to map our current competencies to some of the external resources that we have from Gartner, for example. So on our next slide, they have the top 9 questions that should be in every employee engagement survey. So employee engagement is a piece of that employee experience. Of course, we're aiming to have those very engaged employees. So looking through each question, you can see I highlighted the different focus areas and then threw in pretty tiny text, but you'll have the slides after, what the different competencies are that I see mapping to them. So for example, starting with our first question, we're talking about whether the organization has your best interests in mind when making business decisions. I would argue that's something that we can see in our people and communities competency. So we're talking about that attachment to mission and vision and alignment of people's roles. Our next question, we're talking about whether you're satisfied with the way that the business has been managed and people have been managed during whatever time point that this survey is for. I can see that aligning very well with our communication and collaboration competencies. Going down the list, skipping ahead, you'll see there's a lot around teamwork. So whether that's collaboration in our people and communities, because we're talking about getting inspired and that outer loop interaction, or whether we're looking at the team where you're successfully completing your work together through collaboration and different business processes. I'll pause here because this is our first kind of introduction of bringing in different competencies and how it overlaps with engagement or employee experience. Any feedback from the team or our practitioners joining us today?
You have some conversation in chat about sort of communication channels and how do you get the right information to the right people. I'm summarizing a lot of words. So I think the communication competency, as you noted on the slide, comes into play here. So I think if I were to take one question out of all of that, it's what do I use when for communication?
Sure. I'm definitely going to do the classic consultant, it depends. So if we could actually go back, Simon, you don't mind, to slide 17.
17, okay.
Thank you so much. So here we see a table, and it's further defined in the article we have at the bottom of the page of how to share org-wide communications in Microsoft 365. I think it'll really depend on your company culture. So for example, I used to work at an organization where the company-wide distribution list was always open to anyone at any moment in time. So the idea to initiate a conversation to the whole organization and not have it be vetted through a hierarchical structure was very accepted. So when we looked at things like it was Yammer back in the day, now Viva Engage, that's something that the organization was really comfortable launching and people were very active in because they wanted to create their own communities, and they already had that expectation in the organization, and managers saw and celebrated that kind of interaction. Looking at things like company size will also impact it. For example, my time at Sympraxis Consulting, we had an everyone chat because there was 5 or 6 of us, and you don't have that many people putting content in there, so it's not a notification that's going to go wild and distract you in your day. But if I worked at a company of 1,500 people, maybe an org-wide team would be a bit aggressive with how much content would be in there and how it would be impacting my day-to-day in collaborations and teams. You'll also want to think about things like your audience, whether it's internal, external, limited, it's that open loop, or whether it's that inner loop. Of course, persistence of message. So whether your organization, let's say it's an org-wide team, or maybe org-wide, you have a everyone chat and chats are gone by the end of the day. If you're trying to have longer conversations with more persistence, you might be looking at something like SharePoint News or Viva Engage, where there could be threaded conversations around that topic after that. Just want to pause there, make sure, am I hitting the intention of that question?
I think there's a lot more intention there than there's some really good conversation in the chat, which we probably can't dissect well enough for you. So there. I would suggest you keep going, and we'll let the chat keep going. If there's a specific question, we'll ping you with it.
Sounds good. Yeah, and I know with the addition of Viva Amplify, we don't have time for all of that today, but the idea that we can use that to cross all of these different communication channels, I think will be really impactful, and we'll want to be thoughtful about where those conversations go to when, so it doesn't just become same topic everywhere at the same time always, and adding to our notifications and creating new threads of conversation. All right, so moving forward off of our top 9 questions for Gartner, now let's take a peek at what McKinsey & Company thinks. So they have 9 elements for employee experience that they think that you need to get it right. And they have it in these 3 different pillars. So you'll see we have social experience, we have work experience, and then we have our organization experience. So going through them one by one, since the text is pretty small, in our social experience, we have people in relationships with the question of, am I seen and treated by my leaders as a significant contributor? So this, as a significant contributor, I would argue you probably have access to different communication channels to share what's going on. There's probably defined collaboration as a leader of what you are doing with your groups. And then, of course, there may be people and communities that you're working with. Continuing on social experience, we have teamwork. That pretty clearly is our collaboration spaces. But again, people and communities. When we look at our teamwork, we have formal and informal teamwork, similar to this initiative, where we're all volunteering our time. Often we'll see in people and communities some of these different volunteer groups that pull together to work on initiatives. In social experience, also looking at social climate, so where we create a lot of that conversation, especially in our hybrid scenarios, would sit within that people and community space. Looking over at our work experience, looking at clear responsibilities and resources for you to be successful in your role seems to map very directly to our staff and training. When we look at our work control and flexibility of how you can integrate work into your life, we're looking at different ways of collaborating and maturity there, as well as our formalized business processes. And then when we're looking at growth and rewards, I see that sitting within staff and training as well, having that recognition, that formal recognition. Though I would say we can add informal recognition into people and communities as well, as there's a lot of celebrations that we see happening in things like Viva Engage as well. Our last pillar, looking at organizational experience when it comes to purpose. So the company's purpose aligning, that will come through the communication through the organization. You will try to achieve that mission through your collaboration with different people and communities. The most obvious one that we have is technology. So here is where you see a lot of our other pieces fall in. Earlier, I mentioned this idea that technology is one of the core pillars of your employee experience. So this is where we see customization and development, search, business processes, infrastructure, collaboration, really how you created that environment for you to be getting your work done with your colleagues. And then I would love to hear feedback from the group. Physical environment. So this is where I think when we're looking at employee experience and we're looking at the competencies, I see it starting to get a little bit edgy because we talk about the maturity model really supporting and focusing on Microsoft 365 enabling outcome objectives in the organization. Do you all feel that there are features within Microsoft 365 that are related to our physical space?
So the one, I guess there's ways of capturing. I'm thinking about HR sort of doing assessments on people's desks, and are they set up correctly? So there's a staff and training piece there. Making sure you've got your computer set up, your monitor that's right eye level. So I could see maybe some LinkedIn some Viva learning content there, or maybe there's an assessment form. So there's some business process to make sure that those checks are happening. Certainly in the UK, we are required to do those checks to make sure people are comfortable.
Great points. I see we have a hand from Pia.
Yeah, so when it comes to the physical environment, this has been very clear when we come into the hybrid situation that we want to have good physical environment so we can have good meetings with, good sound, good video, the new AI cameras. But also when we have the physical environment, if we're trying to promote transparency in our systems, but we don't have transparency in the office, where people go into their own rooms. So you also have a mirroring of the company culture. If everyone goes into a room and closes the door, then it's pretty close. But if you have, in Sweden, we talk about activity-based offices. It's pretty much like every office is an activity-based office. And then you also need to, sometimes you need to book a chair or a desk or things like that, where you have that. But also, when it comes to all the cords and cameras and booking the rooms and double booking stuff, and if you didn't, book it, check it when you went in, you lose the room after 10 minutes and you get kicked out. So there is a lot of tech, a lot of Microsoft 365 in the physical space.
I took a lot of notes. I agree. Thanks for sharing that perspective. I hadn't considered including the hybrid setup in that area, and that makes a lot of sense how that impacts your collaboration and even, as you called out, your communication and that transparency reflecting the culture. Anybody else? Good comment in the chat about waiting for Microsoft Places to provide a little more insight into our physical space. We could probably talk about the metaverse a little bit in that area as well. I'll admit I've been resistant to it, and that probably shows in me remembering to include it in this article. So I'm going to add that to our notes as well.
I think as well, cognitive business in the technology as well. Does my company's technology enable me to work efficiently without friction? I think the cognitive business helps there, particularly with Copilot and those kind of activities.
Absolutely. Anyone else before we keep moving forward? Okay, so as I started to lay out these different pieces, you'll see there were a couple on the side that didn't find a bucket. So this led to a little restructure of how I'm thinking about the content. So moving forward, What we originally saw was one pillar of all of our different competencies. And I know in the very early days, it's a little bit like Groundhog Day. You're like, Emily, we're really going to talk about governance, risk, compliance, and management of content going across them again. But as time has gone on, I do really see how that structure supports all of the different items. And this idea of employee experience is also an underlying foundational piece across all of our different competencies. We have cognitive business as our cherry on top, as this isn't something that could stand alone without any of our other pieces. But realistically, what we were just talking about was how related each of these different competencies across that middle layer are. We were talking about staff and training people in communities, and it was impossible not to bring up the ideas of communication and collaboration. So looking at the next slide, it's not as pretty of a visual, but technically speaking, what we're saying is all of these are interrelated in the middle. We have foundational pieces, and then we have our additive in cognitive business. Now, what I like to think this creates for us on our next slide is this beautiful ice cream sundae of Microsoft 365, and we decide how to structure it. Now I'll pause here because this is a really big shift in how we've been talking about it, and I would love to hear everybody's reactions and thoughts. I mean, ice cream this early in the morning.
Looks delicious.
There is indeed a banana, Kevin, right below infrastructure and business process people communities. And I
But
was
what is
torn. Yeah, I was torn on whether that should be one of our core governance, risk, compliance, management of content, employee experience, because it seems like a base item.
At the risk of offending everyone, sometimes a banana is just a banana.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, and the cognitive business extra cherries may have fallen down. Ignore those. Kevin, I see you have a hand. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, maybe it's IT, maybe it's that kind of foundation that's been split into and had search, customization and development wedged in the middle of it.
Fair. And then Simon.
I think what I like about this metaphor is, because I love extending metaphors, is of course after a little while, all of these different types of ice cream start to merge, and that's where we get those intersections between the different competencies. You know, the whole point is you might start off having all of these in separate buckets, but once you put them on the plate, they're all mixed together, and there's overlaps, and there's synthesis of flavors and all these kind of things. So the metaphor is lovely, actually. It doesn't appeal to people's information architecture gland, but I think it does appeal to the real world.
Fair point.
That's what we've been doing for 4 years. We've been stirring up ice cream balls together.
Well, I think, yeah, Marc, you used to have you called it the sausage factory for a while for the collaboration and communication division between the sites. And then sausage is kind of gross. We started with ice cream factory. This is the natural evolution. Ooh, the banana is co-pilot.
That's
Could be true too.
Everything is co-pilot.
The sprinkles, the whipped cream, all the different co-pilots together on top. Oh, good question. Are staff and training intentionally above the others? No, the way I structured the words in the ice cream are completely nonsensical. It's just what fit on the slide, as I did not have Microsoft Designer make me a custom one. But if we like this analogy, we can definitely go further with it.
Going to make everyone on all these calls hungry if we stick with it. We'll all go off our diets.
I'm just cross. I had no ice cream in Seattle, and it's making me realize that.
Molly Moons is a classic for sure. All right, so I will say I'm a little surprised. I thought we'd have some big reactions to the proposed restructure of foundational and additive on top, but let's keep going. And maybe as we're digesting these ideas, we'll have some different reactions. So looking at one of the different explanations of the different stages of employee experience. They go through this idea of attract, hire, onboard, engage, perform, develop, depart. So looking at our different competencies, again, I started to try and bring over these different pieces because we really didn't have the conversation in staff and training or people in communities as robustly around onboarding or that engagement and development. And then we didn't have any reflection of that life cycle fully in business process when it comes to the employee experience. We had it from the admin perspective of closing out different profiles, but we weren't really acknowledging that human experience of going through and departing, capturing that different knowledge. So looking at the updates to the competencies, this is my proposal. So you'll see in our table, we have our core competencies called out, and then our elevating articles are below. So our core competencies, we were trying to keep technology agnostic. And I will say, as I went through this exercise, there's definitely a lot here we see to add, but there's a lot that's still true because of the way we talked about these different items aren't tied to individual and specific pieces of technology. The shift of Yammer to Viva Engage has some implications around naming and some additional features, but at its core, we're still talking about creating those communities in that open outer loop space the same way. So looking at our core competencies in staff and training, I'm recommending that we add in, and by we, I'm offering to be the first pass on the draft, of course, roles and clarity in around responsibilities, and talking more about that employee development and upskilling. Pieces that I see really clearly missing is that understanding of the organizational structure, which is often reflected in our org charts, but understanding how the business works, who to reach out to. We don't have anything talking about formal recognition. So talking about that development and people getting promotions and growing over time. And then we don't have anything reflected there about that individual or team goal management. Adding those pieces would also push us to add some technology into our elevating article to better reflect Viva Learning and Viva Goals. So I'll pause there, just starting off with staff and training. Any feedback? Anyone think there's any pieces missing or think that these pieces don't belong in staff and training?
I think one of the, sorry, I'm not going to raise my hand. I'm just going to speak. I think one of the points you made is important. As we've written these competencies, we have competencies. We have tried to be technology agnostic. So whenever Microsoft changes a brand name or adds a new Viva this or Viva that, we're not rewriting the whole article because now all of a sudden the tools that they give us are different. Obviously, the tools are very important, but what you need to do, as you've outlined, hasn't changed that much. We still need to communicate. We still need to give people career paths. We still need to make sure people know what they need to know to be successful. And I think that to me, that makes me feel good because that means that especially since you've just gone through these articles again, it means that our competency articles still are meaningful, even though a lot of the landscape has moved.
Yeah, and a fair point that it's what we're referencing is employee experience. And while that's such a buzzword at Microsoft right now, and maybe sounds like they invented it, they didn't. It's been around for a really long time. And as Mark said, all these different individual pieces have always been important at work. Sorry, Simon, do I cut you off?
No, what it has done though is we're all learning, aren't we? We're all learning new things on how to run a business, and what the employee experience, the Viva journey's done is sort of elevate some of these competencies which businesses need to have, and maybe I didn't know about that before Viva came along, OKRs, goal management, all of that. So I think, which is fantastic. So that's where the competencies are evolving too, as we learn as well. So that's good.
I love that Microsoft coming out with new releases and features naturally helps advance organizational maturity by introducing new focus areas. I think that's lovely.
Yeah.
Anything else on staff and training before we look at our people and communities?
Do you think any of the approaches to upskilling isn't a word as far as I'm concerned, but training, that do you think all of the tools that are available around Viva Learning and some of the new, the newer Viva stuff, do you think it actually would change the way people think about training? Or do you think it's still, we've got to train our people and we just have new tools to do it?
Fair question. I see more a shift in preferred training content modalities and how we structure the content itself, not necessarily the need for it. I would say, looking at when I first started my career in tech, I watched 8-hour videos that were beginning to end every single thing you can do, back on when it was lynda.com before it became LinkedIn Learning.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think we shift our focus and how we talk about the solutions for these micro answers and these in context answers, and not necessarily needing the A to Z, but really focusing on, well, this is my outcome objective and this is the piece I need to work on. So making the content smaller, more consumable, and easier to navigate to be aligned with outcome objectives. I see the conversation talking about a little bit, but no, I think from a very high level, I see it still consistently being the same, but maybe there's more cultural acceptance of the responsibility of the managers and internal to support that upskilling.
That's an interesting point, the outcome objectives, as opposed to, yes, we've got to train people. And I think that's a maturity measure, right? I mean, I think in some of the large organizations I've worked in or consulted to, there's been a lot of training. But did it make anybody better at anything? So making sure that those two things are connected sort of puts you up a higher maturity level in your staff and training thinking than if you're just, everybody gets the same binder on their shelf or the link to the same video or the whatever. It's, just in time knowledge or making sure that the outcome objectives are reached. So I think we hit that in that competency, but maybe making sure that that's a little tighter in the language would be good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm taking a note on that for us.
I'm new to this maturity model. I just found out, and I don't understand why. I just found out about this. I work a lot with adoption and training, and I do leadership programs. And I judge an organization by their training programs, like how well connected and how well empowered the end user is to have their training towards common goals. Because sometimes very common here in Sweden is that, oh, you know what you should learn, so you just go and learn that and you talk to your manager about what you want to do. And if it costs money, they say no. But if it is actually about, okay, our organization needs to focus on these things that we need to know, and it comes down through the managers where they actually have this requirement to implement that in their business processes with the constant learning, to actually also set aside 4 hours a week, which I think is like that is top notch. More than that shouldn't be used, but and it should be done at least on a monthly level, not a yearly level, because everything happens so fast. And my issue with Viva Learning is that it's just, we don't get the statistics. We cannot assign people the stuff. We can't look at like, how is this organization doing? So it's always like training is that it's available to you. And that I hate that. It should be like, no, you in this role need to have all of this. This is required. And then we have other stuff that is not relevant to your role, but is out there that is available to you.
That's a great point. I think as we're looking at these competencies and the introduction of artificial intelligence, I honestly get really nervous because there is such a heavy focus on asynchronous learning, and that doesn't allow for necessarily the time spent that an employee needs to actually do that learning in their workday. So now when we're talking about this work-life balance, we're pushing learning to be something that's done in your spare time additive outside of work. And there's some big gaps that we're going to need to fill for people who are less comfortable in that tech skills gap. But also, as we do things faster with artificial intelligence, that doesn't necessarily mean that Copilot also gives us infinite cognitive currency and energy. So when we talk about staff and training, people and communities, employee experience, we're actually talking about work-life balance. And that is going to greatly shift as we're able to do more in less time. How do we spend our time? How are our days broken up? I'm not necessarily going to do quadruple the really smart work, because there's still some need for that human, I would call it percolation. We're making slides, got some help from Copilot to be pulling them together quickly, but there needs to be some downtime for me personally where I'm thinking about what it means and how that works out. So hopefully, as we're employing all these different pieces, we're creating more time for that deep think, more time for that learning, and hopefully we can have them reflected in the competencies that way.
It sounds
All
like
right.
when we're doing our elevating content, we pick out those issues with Viva Learning and that feedback loop. It sounds like while it might be at level 300, possibly, it's not at level 400 because it doesn't give you that way of measuring the impact to be able to move up the further levels. So I'm quite interested to call that out, pass on to the Viva Learning team as well.
Yeah, I would love to share a slide with you too that I have, Simon Joy, of comparing Viva Learning to learning pathways. And I would not argue that learning pathways is a lower maturity solution. I think it depends how you use it, how you employ it. I think there's added capabilities and integration that Viva Learning has that learning pathways doesn't. But there's also a lot that learning pathways has that Viva Learning doesn't. So especially if we're talking free version. So the idea that you can't even have pages in Viva Learning without paying, you can just have documents, I would argue pushes an organization down the maturity level, as we've been having people document content into pages and into the intranet. So I would say that in that case, learning pathways is a better support.
Oh, yeah.
But that's a whole hot topic. I think we can spend an hour on comparing those two and where they sit, but hopefully we'll build it into our elevating article a little bit. I know we're at our last 5, so I just want to call out, looking at people and communities, that there is a lot more there that I would say we missed in our first pass around the different elements of that employee engagement, well-being, inclusion and belonging. Accessibility isn't really covered in any of our competencies. And then again, that informal recognition. Simon Hudson, I see you have a hand.
The people and communities, you're absolutely right. There's a bunch of stuff missing. And that's one of the things that's prompted Sharon and I to start working on the employee experience and engagement competency. It would be great to have a conversation with you offline, Emily, and see where we think the overlap is, whether it should be one competency or two or whatever. So when you've got some time to chat with us, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
What you're seeing here is some of that sausage factory stuff that Emily alluded to, where we as a core team are talking to each other all the time about, well, did we get this right? Should we adjust this? Should we add a competency? Should we subtract a competency? So it's an ongoing thing, and we're always looking for your input. Pia's hand is up.
Pia, yeah.
Yeah, I would say I would not like to put these together. Because staff and training is, when you're the little square or something, the piece of puzzle to put in to do work. As in people in communities, you're a people and you're learning from each other and you're talking and you have those relationships. So they're very different in what I do when it comes to adoption and who I put in charge of these things, or try to put in charge when I hand over to the customer. Because it's, you know, the one is more culture and the other one is like really like, okay, do we have the right people? Do we have the right roles? Do we know what we're doing? And over here, do we know who we're doing it with, or, you know, these things. So I vote against to putting them together.
A question for you. So the one that I get stuck on when we're talking about our staff and training versus people and communities are when we empower our champions. Where do you see the champions sitting? Are they in people and communities, or are they in staff and training?
I always think that the champions, they're, you know, normal people who loves tech. They don't decide anything. They can test and try and spread the news, being happy in balloons and t-shirts. Staff and training, that is me putting on the hard hat as an HR and be like, okay, our project managers need to do this. This is where it needs to go, where we actually need to be more formal. So where the staff and training, the champions can be a part of that. But they're mostly in people and communities, I would say. You know, if someone, you know, it comes like, do you love forms? That's obviously people and communities and not staff and training.
Yeah, I like that perspective. You'll see that I started to hit the formal, informal on recognition, because there's formal recognition in your job because you met your roles and responsibilities. And then there's recognition because I was an awesome teammate and did someone a favor and they shouted me out on Viva Engage. So I'm actually starting to see now, also talking about that champions and learning, a lot of informal learning and evangelism in people and communities as well. So that's an interesting division for us to explore more. Well, I think we are about at time, and it sounds like we have more conversations internally as we explore these different areas. And just want to welcome again anyone that is interested in this conversation. You're more than welcome to join us as we write out these articles, we figure this out, we take these next steps. As you can see, this is kind of an inside look of how we talk about it internally and work on it together. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to get involved. We love having all of these different perspectives, and it definitely helps us hit the mark a lot better. And thank you to the Maturity Model team for having me back after a long hiatus. I'm really looking forward to continuing our collaborations.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Emily. It's been great.
Lovely job.
Appreciate all the new thinking.
Definitely.
Thanks a lot.
Right, well, have a good rest of the week. We'll see you on April the 16th.